The night the road kept its distance. The drive was supposed to be forgettable, the kind that fades as soon as the engine is turned off. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would stay with them. Only a long, dark road and the steady movement of headlights through winter trees. They left their friend's house a little before midnight, carrying the quiet tiredness that comes after too much talking and too much sitting in warm rooms. And the first part of the drive felt exactly like every other late return they had ever made, with the radio low, the windows slightly fogged, and the road unfolding in patient, predictable lines. The countryside around them was mostly empty at that hour, a sequence of dark paddocks and tree lines that seemed to repeat themselves no matter how far they went. And for a long while, neither of them said very much, not because anything was wrong, but because there was nothing left that needed saying. At some point, the air inside the car began to feel heavier, carrying a faint, unfamiliar smell that reminded her of warm metal or old dust. And she noticed a slight irritation on her skin that she assumed came from the seatbelt or the rough fabric of her clothes. The road dipped and rose. The headlights caught and released the trunks of passing trees, and she found herself watching the rhythm of it all, with the distant focus of someone half lost in thought. When she finally looked over at her husband, she saw that his hands were tighter on the steering wheel than before, and that his eyes were fixed forward in a way that suggested concentration rather than simple fatigue. But when she asked if everything was all right, he only nodded and kept driving. And the question seemed to dissolve somewhere between them without really being answered. It was only when they turned into their own street and the familiar shape of their house appeared that she felt the quiet sense of relief that comes with being done for the night. But that feeling did not last, because as soon as they were inside, shoes kicked off and lights switched on, she noticed that the house felt colder than it should have, and that the silence had a different weight to it, as if the rooms were waiting rather than sleeping. She went to the bathroom to wash her hands and caught sight of her reflection, looking more tired than she expected, and that was when she noticed a small, precise mark on her skin that she was certain had not been there earlier, a neat shape that looked less like an injury and more like a careful impression. She called him in, and they stood there together, trying to decide if it was new or if they had somehow both failed to notice it before. And in the end, they told themselves it was nothing, that people miss small things all the time, especially late at night. But when he walked back into the kitchen and glanced at the clock, he stopped, checked his watch, and then checked the clock again. And in that quiet moment, with the house still and the road outside empty, they both understood that there was a stretch of the night that neither of them could place anywhere at all. The hour that wouldn't fit. They agree not to talk about it at first, because saying it out loud makes it sound less manageable. But silence does not make the missing time any easier to live with. It only gives it more room to settle. Morning arrives in the ordinary way, with pale light through the curtains and the distant sound of cars starting somewhere in the neighborhood. And for a short while it almost feels like the night has already begun to lose its importance, as if whatever unease followed them home might fade with sleep. She notices the mark again while getting dressed, still cleanly shaped, still without the bruised colors that usually follow any kind of knock or scrape, and she finds herself touching the skin around it with the careful curiosity reserved for things that do not quite make sense. He tries to keep the mood practical, suggesting they must have taken a wrong turn or stopped longer than they remember, and she wants to believe him, because it is easier than admitting that neither of them can place where those missing minutes belong. They go about the day in parallel, each carrying the same quiet thought without fully sharing it. And it is only when he checks the car and mentions the fuel gauge, lower than it should be for the distance they remember driving, that the unease returns with more weight. In the afternoon, they sit at the kitchen table with a notepad and write down the times they know for certain. The moment they left, the moment they arrived. And the simple arithmetic leaves a blank space that refuses to be filled by any reasonable explanation. She calls their friends to confirm when they said goodbye, and the answer matches what they already thought they knew, which somehow makes things worse, not better. And by early evening, both of them are watching the house in small, distracted ways, as if expecting something else to arrive along with the dusk. That night, sleep comes unevenly, and she wakes more than once with the sense that something has just moved out of reach of memory, like a thought that vanishes the moment you try to hold it. And when she finally gets up, she notices that the house feels different, not changed in any obvious way, but quieter, as if the walls themselves are listening. Over the next few days, small things begin to happen that would not matter on their own. A light left on that neither of them remembers switching. A radio tuned to a station neither of them uses. The car door found unlocked when both are sure it was secured. And each time they tell themselves it is only distraction, only the result of thinking too much about one strange night. She starts to feel unwell, not dramatically, just a steady discomfort that comes and goes without pattern. And he begins to wake before his alarm with the vague certainty that he has been dreaming, even though he cannot recall what about. They talk about seeing a doctor, about taking a short trip, about anything that might return their days to their old, forgettable shape, but the mark on her skin remains unchanged, and the space in their timeline remains just as empty. And one evening, while standing in the yard and looking out toward the dark line of trees beyond the fence, she realizes with a quiet, sinking certainty that whatever took that hour has not finished with them yet. Asterisk. Patterns in the dark. The strange details stop feeling random once they begin repeating. What seemed like fatigue starts aligning into something more precise. And repetition has a way of demanding attention. By the end of the week, the unease begins to organize itself into something more deliberate. No longer a loose feeling, but a sequence of moments that seem to acknowledge one another. She notices that her nausea follows the same hours each day, rising in the late afternoon and easing only after nightfall, while he realizes that the radio static in the car appears on the same stretch of road even when he changes stations. They compare notes reluctantly, speaking as if the house itself might overhear, and discover that both of them remember a faint glow outside the windshield on the drive home. Not bright enough to define, but persistent enough to return in fragments when they close their eyes. They take the car back along the same route in daylight, pointing out bends and landmarks, trying to anchor memory to geography. Yet certain sections feel shorter than they should, the distance collapsing in a way that leaves them slightly disoriented. When they stop by the roadside to get their bearings, she becomes aware of a low, pressure-like sensation in her chest that fades as soon as they drive on. And neither of them can explain why the relief feels conditional, as if it depends on not lingering. The first confirmation that they are not alone in their confusion comes accidentally, during a conversation with a neighbor who mentioned seeing headlights pulled over near the foothills on the same night. Cars stopped at odd angles, as though their drivers had stepped out briefly and then changed their minds. The detail settles heavily between them because it matches the vague image that has been circling her thoughts. An image of standing outside the car with the engine still running, though she cannot say when or why. They search local news archives and community boards, finding nothing official. Only a few short comments about strange lights and delayed arrivals that week. Remarks dismissed by others as weather or imagination. At home, small disturbances continue with increasing regularity. The clock in the living room losing minutes overnight. The television powering on to a blank screen. The faint smell from the car reappearing in closed rooms. And each time they note it down, the list grows more consistent rather than more chaotic. One evening, as dusk settles and the trees beyond their yard darken into a single mass, She feels a sudden certainty that the missing hour is not empty at all, but crowded with impressions that refuse to arrange themselves. And when she turns to tell him, she finds him already staring toward the same stretch of darkness, his expression fixed as if he is recognizing something just out of view. They stand there without speaking, aware that the pattern has crossed from memory into the present, and that whatever shaped the road that night may be closer than it has ever been, waiting for the moment when stopping the car will no longer feel like a choice at the end again. The field beyond the trees. Some places look ordinary until you realize you have been avoiding them. Memory does not always erase. Sometimes it simply steps aside. And when it does, what remains can feel heavier than anything you remember. They decide to go back near the foothills on a quiet afternoon, not because they expect answers, but because the act of avoiding the area has started to shape their days more than either of them wants to admit. The drive is uneventful at first. The same bends, the same scattered houses, the same stretches of trees, yet she notices that her body reacts before her thoughts do, her shoulders tightening and her breathing becoming shallow as they approach a section of road that neither of them has marked on any map, but both of them recognize without speaking. He slows the car without saying why, and when they pass a narrow opening in the trees, she feels a sudden certainty that this is not the first time they have seen it. They pull over a short distance ahead and walk back along the verge, the air strangely still, the sounds of insects and distant traffic muted as if absorbed by the ground itself. Beyond the trees is a wide, uneven field, unremarkable in daylight. Yet she cannot shake the feeling that it once looked different, or that something once stood there that did not belong to the landscape. They do not step far into the grass, only enough to look around, and that is when she notices a faint outline in the soil, not a hole or a mound, but a subtle change in texture and color that forms a broad, precise shape visible only from certain angles. He crouches and touches the ground, finding it slightly warmer than the surrounding earth, though the sun is already low, and they exchange a look that carries more questions than either of them is ready to say. As they walk back toward the road, she is struck by a brief, intrusive impression of standing there at night, of other cars pulled up in the distance, of movement at the far edge of her vision, and the image is so sudden that she stops, waiting for it to finish forming, but it dissolves as quickly as it arrived. On the drive home, neither of them speaks, and when they do finally talk, they limit themselves to careful descriptions rather than interpretations, as if naming things too clearly might make them less manageable over the next few days. Her physical symptoms intensify, and he begins to experience short gaps in concentration, moments where he finds himself in the middle of a task without recalling starting it. And they agree to see doctors, to gather normal explanations, even as the normal explanations fail to gather around them. Tests return without clarity, reassurance without conviction, and at home, the small disturbances continue, now joined by the occasional sensation that someone has just left a room she is about to enter. One night, lying awake, she becomes aware of a pressure in the air, not on her skin, but in the space itself, as if the room is briefly holding its breath, and when she opens her eyes, she is certain, for a fraction of a second, that there is a darker shape standing where the hallway meets the bedroom, a shape that is already withdrawing by the time she focuses on it, leaving behind only the quiet certainty that whatever waited in that field has begun to follow them back. When the night stops letting go, avoidance works only until the thing being avoided learns your routine. Some presences do not announce themselves. They simply begin to arrive. And once they do not need to be invited again. By the time they both admit that something is actively intruding on their lives, the house has already developed a new pattern of quiet, one that no longer feels like rest, but like waiting. She wakes in the early hours with the steady certainty that she has been standing somewhere else just moments before, though her feet are still under the blankets. And he begins to find the car warm in the mornings, the engine cold, but the air inside carrying that same faint metallic smell they noticed on the night of the drive. They compare these details in low voices, no longer trying to laugh them away, and start writing everything down with dates and times, discovering that the disturbances cluster around the same hours, usually just before dawn or just after sunset, as if whatever is happening prefers the edges of the day. One evening, while reviewing their notes, she realizes that the mark on her skin has not faded at all, and that the skin around it has become oddly sensitive, reacting to touch with a dull, spreading ache that seems to extend deeper than it should. The first clear interruption happens on a night that begins without incident, when they go to bed early, tired of waiting for something to happen, and more tired of watching each other listen for it. She is asleep when she becomes aware of a sensation like pressure on her shoulders. Not weight exactly, but the feeling that the air itself has thickened, and she opens her eyes to find the room dimmer than it should be, the outlines of furniture slightly blurred, as if she is looking through a layer of glass. She tries to speak and cannot, not because her mouth will not move, but because the thought of speaking seems to drift away before it reaches her. In the same moment, she is aware of him stirring beside her, making a sound that is more breath than word. And then the sensation recedes, leaving the room exactly as it was, with no trace except the way her heart continues to beat as if it has been running. They sit up for the rest of the night, lights on, saying very little. And in the morning, he admits that he remembers standing somewhere open and dark, with the sound of wind moving through grass, though he cannot say when this memory belongs. Over the following days, similar episodes repeat in smaller ways. Moments of stillness where time seems to pause and then resume with a slight misalignment. And they begin to realize that the missing hour from the drive may not be contained in the past at all, but distributed across their present. When they finally speak to others in the area, carefully, without leading questions, they hear enough half-familiar details to understand that they are not the only ones measuring their days in gaps. And one evening, as she stands by the window and looks toward the dark line of trees in the distance, she feels that same pressure in the air again, closer this time, as if the boundary between that field and their home has quietly stopped existing. What the road never returns, some mysteries do not end. They only learn how to stay quiet. Not everything that arrives leaves in the same shape, and not every absence is empty. They stop trying to chase explanations and begin instead to live around the gaps, because the effort of naming what they cannot place has started to thin their days into something fragile. The house returns to its ordinary sounds, or at least to sounds they can pretend are ordinary, and the nights grow less dramatic, though never truly calm. The mark on her skin remains, unchanged and precise, a small, steady reminder that something once paused there with intention. And he continues to wake before his alarm with the feeling that he has just been somewhere that does not belong to any map he knows. They consider moving, then decide against it, not out of bravery, but because the idea of carrying the same quiet into another set of rooms feels more exhausting than staying. The field beyond the trees becomes something they no longer visit, though it never leaves their conversations, and occasionally, when the light is low, they notice how the horizon seems to hold itself in a slightly different way, as if a familiar line has been traced over and corrected. Over time, the disturbances soften into subtler forms. A clock that loses a minute and then gains it back. A radio that clicks on and off once and never again. A sense of pressure in the air that comes and goes without warning. And they learn to let these moments pass without comment. Not because they are resolved, but because attention seems to encourage them. She returns to her routines, and he to his, and friends remark that they look better, more rested, as though the story has ended somewhere behind them. Yet sometimes, while driving, they find that a stretch of road has slipped by without either of them remembering it, and they exchange a brief look and keep going, choosing not to pull over, choosing not to test the edges of that forgetting. They do not speak often about the missing hour anymore, but it has not disappeared. It has simply become less concentrated, spread thinly across many small moments that never quite add up. Once, late at night, she wakes with the sense that someone has just stepped away from the bed. And though there is no sound, no movement, she lies still until the feeling fades. And in the morning, she cannot be sure whether it was a dream or only the echo of one. He, for his part, sometimes stands in the yard and listens to the wind in the trees, convinced that if he waits long enough, he will recognize a rhythm he almost remembers. But it never quite arrives. Life continues, because it always does. And the world does not make room for questions that cannot be asked clearly. Yet on certain evenings, when the light turns the fields into flat sheets of shadow, and the road seems to hold its distance a little too carefully, they both feel the same quiet certainty that whatever took that hour did not take it away, but set it aside, and that somewhere, not far from the place where the trees begin, it is still waiting to be noticed again.